welcome back to Prevention Works. I'm your co-host, Emily Hatchwell, the Opiate Program Specialist.
And I'm Michelle Simons, Prevention Coordinator.
And today we have a special guest, Wency Kent, who works closely with us on the prevention grants. So if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Okay. I'm Wency Kent. I'm the Director of Behavioral Health and Prevention Programs at Bridgewell. And I'm a long-term treatment provider and a long-term prevention specialist.
And she's definitely one of the originals on the grants that Michelle and I work on. So the first thing, can you talk a little bit about how you got into working in the prevention field?
Oh, well, like everything else, I got into it accidentally. So back in, I would say, 2003, there were a number of Lynn city leaders who started having discussions about their concerns about the growing heroin epidemic in the City of Lynn. At that time, there were a lot of concerns with prescription drug misuse and opioid misuse, prescription opioid misuse. And so they decided they wanted to be proactive and do something, so they wrote a grant and received funding from Purdue Pharma, which was part of a class action suit that they had to give back to communities. So it provided us with the seed money to create a prevention coalition. So we gathered together many local providers, police, school people, city officials, youth serving agencies, and went through a very lengthy strategic planning process that was facilitated with the funding that we received. So we basically went through a process of doing a community-wide needs assessment and trying to decide what the priority areas were and what we wanted to do to address those priority areas. And of course we had to narrow it down because you come up with dozens of priority areas, and we had to narrow it down to a few. And then we just began putting some things together. Our early focus was on general youth risk prevention. So we were sort of targeting youth and families around alcohol misuse and tobacco misuse and a little bit of marijuana misuse. And after a few years of that, we started talking as a group about the growing concerns about opioids and overdoses in the city. And we're trying to figure out a way to get some prevention work in that area funded. So we did actually apply for a federal grant that we did not receive. But then the state came through with funding for opioid overdose prevention in 2008, and that's where things began to take off.
Oh, okay. And what were some of the things that you saw from the needs assessment that you were focusing on?
The original one?
Yes.
Or the opioid
Both.
one? Because we had to do
The original one is
had to do
interesting
two.
though, right? Yeah.
Well, wow, the original one was 16 years ago. So I don't
Well, you know,
remember
whatever you can come
all
up
the
with.
details, but I think that the target areas, we saw that there was a real lack of awareness about the risks associated with alcohol misuse in teens. There weren't adequate family supports in place, and there was a lot of need for education. And I think we found sort of very similar issues when we did the needs assessment for the opioid funding. You know, a lack of awareness about opioid risks and a lack of awareness about overdoses and how they can occur and how to prevent them. A lack of understanding in the community about opioid addiction, and the particular challenge was with first responders and police, EMTs, who just really didn't understand why someone would overdose over and over and over again. And then just sort of a general need for education in the community about the risk factors, knowing that kids don't start out misusing opioids, they start with other drugs, but it can lead to more devastating problems in use later on.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool because the education piece is kind of how our show came about, just to educate the public and talk to the public about substance use and addiction. So that journey has actually brought us here, which is pretty cool.
We go. Full circle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. So what's really interesting, I mean, you brought up the Purdue Pharma, which is something that's currently in
the news.
Yeah, a lot. So our funding actually came from that one of those
The
lawsuits?
very original funding that we got back in 2003.
Yep.
And it wasn't a large amount of money. It was $25,000 in seed money to
Yep.
just sort of get a prevention coalition off the ground.
Right.
And then it just built from there, and we received, access to other funding sources, private funding sources, state funding sources. And it's just, we've had prevention funding in place now for 16 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
So kind of opened the door for all of it.
Absolutely.
Wow,
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
So I have a ton of questions to ask.
Well, fire. Yeah. Why not?
So the opioid overdoses, what year did that, did we start working on prevention towards that? Because originally it was alcohol and
That was in 2008.
08, okay.
And the reason why the City of Lynn received that funding, it was one of either 13 or 16 original communities that
Yeah.
received this funding based on their overdose numbers. And obviously our numbers are a lot higher than they were back in 2008.
Right.
But, we were at the higher end even back then.
Yeah.
So the... God. I'm sorry, I just went blank.
No, it's all right.
Yeah.
What was the question
So
again? I'm
yeah,
sorry.
so 2008, the opioid overdoses started to really pick up in Lynn, right?
And they were steady. I mean, back then we were seeing maybe 60 a year. Unfortunately, that's swelled to
Compared to
closer to
now?
500.
500,
yeah.
Right now. But we're
Yeah.
dealing with a very different issue than we were.
Different
back
drug,
then.
yeah.
Different drug.
Yeah.
Much more potency
Yeah.
and much greater use.
Yeah.
So it just, what had happened was that the federal government had given all the states money to conduct epidemiological studies
Yep.
in order to decide what the prevention priorities were going to be. And most of the country decided to focus on alcohol use
Yep.
and underage drinking.
Right.
Massachusetts, I believe, was the only one that decided to address opioid overdoses.
Wow. So that's
Okay.
why we see in these prevention coalition meetings, most of the different cities, we see actually focusing a lot more on alcohol, right? Or,
Well, and largely because a lot of communities are doing a lot of primary prevention work.
Okay.
Our focus has always, because that was their background,
Yep.
our focus has always been different from the very beginning because there were so many treatment providers, and because I was managing this coalition from
yeah.
the beginning,
Yeah.
my background was in treatment, so that was always my bias. So I was always focused on intervention and treatment and not so much on, well, I was focused on prevention, but everything I did sort of revolved around intervention, and that's why our focus was different from the very beginning.
yeah. So
And
you-
now other providers have, or other communities have, raised the bar on their end as they've
Yep.
learned more. A lot of them weren't as aware of addiction and opioid addiction in particular as we were just because of our treatment experience.
Right.
Yeah.
So we took a different tack from the very beginning, and they went in a different direction, and I think everybody's sort of come together now,
Okay.
across the state. And every community is different. There are some communities that have been very successful at connecting with schools. Others have been very successful at connecting with the police, other treatment providers. So everybody has strengths in different areas. So.
yeah.
So I know you said that your focus was on treatment. So how did that play into the prevention work that you did, like you being in treatment? How did that influence it?
I think I was just always focused from the very beginning on using prevention as a means of getting people into services.
Okay.
And wasn't so much focused on younger kids. There were other agencies in the city that were doing more youth-based prevention, so I saw this as an opportunity to focus more on the treatment side of things. And we weren't using the funding for treatment, we were using it to identify areas that would help people get into treatment, like post-overdose prevention, like outreach, things of that nature. Identifying the highest risk people and trying to understand what the barriers were. It's just always been my priority area.
Yeah.
And what I've sort of done is incorporated a lot of what I've learned over the years on prevention into the treatment work we do.
Right.
And using the knowledge of addiction to develop prevention strategies.
Awesome. So yeah, it's all full circle thing. God, I was just going to ask you something and I lost it.
You just,
Man, it seems to be going around today.
Yeah, I know.
Well, what were some of the original programs that you had with these grants? What were some of the original things you were doing?
are we going back to 2003 or are we going back to 2008?
Let's do 2008 because
Yeah.
that's kind of our focus.
Okay. So in 2008, the things that we were initially focused on was educating the using community and their families and those who are at higher risk of overdose on overdose risk recognition, response, and prevention.
Yep.
So working with treatment providers to get them to provide this kind of education to their consumers. We're also trying to do some work with the medical community because they didn't really understand addiction. The last generation of doctors did not receive education on addiction when they're in medical school. It's a relatively new development.
Yeah.
So they didn't really understand what they were dealing with. There was overprescribing going on. They didn't know how to manage someone who maybe was in their office seeking medication. They would either just give it to them just to get them out of their office, or they would just throw them out with no access to treatment.
Right.
We also wanted to work with the police to educate them because, like I said before, they had difficulty sort of understanding why does this keep happening. We just revived this person yesterday. Why did they overdose again today?
Right.
So there was a lot of training involved in the police, and part of that was geared towards helping them to manage the challenges inherent in their work, but also to reduce the barriers to calling 911 because a lot of overdose victims didn't want to call the police. They were afraid of the response. They were afraid of being arrested. They're afraid of losing their housing. I mean, there were a lot of potential ramifications to it. So we were trying to break down a lot of those barriers. So there was a big emphasis on very targeted education to the people that were serving the people that we wanted to get through. And then as we began to see the numbers continue to increase, a lot of this education was now embedded in treatment, but overdose numbers were still going up. So then we began to focus on increasing access to Narcan.
Yep.
And again, that was a statewide issue that was not unique to Lynn, but that became our focus because we were trying to save lives. Because overdoses were going up, deaths were going up.
Yep.
So we wanted to at least have more of this harm reduction strategy available so that someone could live long enough, hopefully, to get into treatment.
Yeah.
So that was our early focus. In 2013, the state decided to expand the number of communities that had this funding, but there wasn't enough money to fund more communities. So what they had is they had the original 13 or 16, I can't remember the number, communities, identify a couple surrounding communities that they would form a cluster with and mentor them in developing this. So we joined forces with Salem and Peabody to sort of help them develop their own strategies.
Right.
But Lynn, Salem, and Peabody are three very different communities.
Yeah.
And their areas of priority are different. Peabody already had an existing youth-based prevention coalition in place, so their interest was more in addressing overdoses. Salem didn't really have a prevention coalition, and so their interest was in both areas. And Lynn already had existing smaller prevention coalitions in place, so Lynn wanted to focus on overdose prevention as well. So every community is different, everybody's needs are different, and how they wanted to go about it was different, which is a challenge, but you work with what the community wants. So after that, because even after everything that was being done, the numbers were still going up, and that's when we started to focus on post-overdose care.
Yep.
And that was something that a lot of other communities were recognizing as a need as well, because people would present in the emergency room, they would be treated and
Poorly
sent home.
at times. Right.
With maybe a brochure if they were interested in services.
Right.
they're very high risk of overdosing
Which
again
probably
when
got
they walk
tossed
out
in
of
the trash
ED.
on their way out the door, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and they're very high risk of overdosing again because at that point they're going through withdrawal because they've received Narcan, knocks the opioids off the receptor sites,
Feel
and
horrible.
sends them into withdrawal. So they're sick. So their inclination is to eliminate their withdrawal symptoms and use again and possibly overdose again. So we knew that what was being done was not enough. So we spent a few years talking with the hospital, with North Shore Medical
Particularly
Center.
Union and
Well, North Shore Medical Center in general,
yeah.
which operates Union and Salem emergency rooms.
Yep.
And sort of talking to them about this, and eventually developed a program where we have recovery coaches on call to both emergency rooms who would respond on a 24/7 basis to calls from the emergency room.
Right.
And in the meantime, there was other outreach that was being done in the community that was addressing this very issue. The Lynn Police Department established a behavioral health unit that was doing outreach. Healthy Streets, which is a local, needle exchange and harm reduction program, was doing outreach. So there were a lot of people trying to connect with those who were the most vulnerable, and try to get them into services. And that's been one of our more significant areas of focus over the last couple of years as the numbers have continued to rise.
Yeah. So we hear the question of the value of recovery coaches is always brought up. We hear it sometimes even at our own site. Could you just talk a little bit on exactly what a recovery coach is and does? And I know there's a wide variety from different agencies, but from our particular agency, from Bridgewell, and just talk on that a little bit.
Well, what our recovery coaches will do is they will go to the ED when someone is presenting there, either after an overdose or if they come into the emergency room looking for detox or some kind of help with their substance use, or maybe they're being treated for a medical consequence of their use, like an abscess or sepsis or something like that. And the recovery coach will come in and just spend some time with them, offer them support, help advocate for services for them, provide follow-up. Sometimes they accept the follow-up, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they've been able to successfully get them into a detox or some kind of program, or some of them just continue with a recovery coach for a period of time. And a lot of what they do is connect the individual to supports within the community and help them build a safe, sober support network. And really, sort of nurture them through that process, and like I said, help advocate for them. I mean, that's probably one of the primary roles of a recovery coach, is providing advocacy for an individual who just doesn't know where to begin.
Yeah,
definitely. So sometimes what the general public considers success versus what a recovery coach might consider success. Could you explain that a little bit? Because I know we measure it a little bit differently from the treatment side, right?
Well, I think that so many people define success as achieving sobriety or getting into treatment.
Right.
And it's too narrow a focus.
Yeah.
Because for the individuals that we serve who are so disenfranchised, success might be just going to a meeting for the first time in their life.
Yeah.
Success might be, maybe getting into a detox, or maybe, agreeing to meet with someone, or finding a place to live, or there's very broad definitions
Could
of
be
success.
as simple as showing up, right?
Yeah,
just meeting
for a first follow-up appointment. It really has to be what that individual defines as success. Too often we impose our own definition of success.
Right, so it's up to the individual
to
getting
define
the
that.
service.
And it's the same thing with prevention in general, because there's been a lot of time and funding and energy put into prevention on the North Shore in the last 10, 15 years. And, we're still seeing issues.
Right.
But what the community doesn't see is what's going on behind the scenes. They don't see the policy change. They don't see that the medical community has incorporated rigorous training on addiction and safe prescribing practices into grand rounds and regular CME requirements and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
They don't see all the things that have been institutionalized, like screening that's being done in the schools and programs that have been put in place that target, higher risk kids.
Right.
Or, something that policy changes they don't see.
Right.
They don't see all the, businesses and providers that are now proactive in educating people about risk. And prevention is a generational change.
Yeah.
It's not something you do
about
for 5 or 10 years and you fix everything.
Changing our whole culture, really.
We're changing a whole culture.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a couple generation old viewpoints about addiction and use and heroin use and all these kinds of things, and those attitudes don't change quickly.
You guys have been doing some really interesting work with the data. Wendy, so I'd love to hear from both of you guys, because both Wendy and Emily collect data from all the overdoses in Lynn and
Salem.
Salem. So could maybe both of you guys talk on it a little bit?
So for one of the grants, part of what we do is we, like she said, collect information on overdoses, and that's basically everything. We collect overdoses, gender, ethnicity,
location, age,
method of use,
whether Narcan was used before the first responders arrived or afterwards, whether or not there were warrants that were involved in the case, whether or not this was a overdose that occurred as a result of a relapse or just getting out of jail or just getting out of a treatment program or something like that, or whether this was a first-time use, whether they used sporadically. I mean, there's a lot of data and information. What they acknowledge using, some people we don't get that, the police don't get that information from, some they do. But just a lot of interesting, just little pieces of information that we put together and have analyzed. So we have 5.5 years of data for Lynn and 3.5 years of data for Salem.
Yeah,
That's a lot of numbers.
And every quarter we sort of go through that and try to piece it together to see what the trends are.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to analyze because the trends can change monthly.
Yep.
The product changes all the time. We never know what people are buying on the street or its potency or what they're using.
Right.
Sometimes people don't know what they're using. They might think they use cocaine and maybe it was actually fentanyl.
Right, which happens often.
So they're surprised that they overdose.
Yep.
So we're trying to understand those trends, and then after we sort of see what the trends are, then what we try to do is meet with people in the community to collect some anecdotal information about, this is what the data is telling us. What do you think is behind this?
Yep.
So that we can use that to inform outreach or any strategies that we do implement. Maybe there's some subgroups that we need to reach out to more proactively, more aggressively. Maybe we're seeing improvements in some areas. What's really interesting, and this is something that we just were looking at the other day, was how much Narcan is used before the first responders arrived now compared to 5 years ago.
Right.
So 5 years ago, maybe 7% of the time, someone at the scene administered Narcan. Fast forward 5 years, and it's happening about 25% of the time.
That's huge.
So that's a significant difference. So that's the availability. That's the result of the availability of Narcan through any pharmacy. Anybody can get their hands on it. So a lot more lives were being saved.
Yeah.
And we always have to look at that when we look at the numbers, because even though the numbers had gone up, even though it looks worse and it looks like nothing is working, you could well imagine. You don't even want to imagine how many more people would have died.
Yeah.
Or overdose just in general if nothing had been done
Narcan wasn't
over
available.
the last 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess so our audience can know that Narcan's available at the pharmacy. There's a standing order prescription.
For the whole state.
For the whole state. So if anybody wants to come pick it up, they can just go to any pharmacy window and say they want Narcan, and whatever their insurance is, they would pay their copay, right?
Yeah, like their medication copay.
Yeah, so that's huge. And then also places like Healthy Streets, offer it to people that are still in active addiction usually?
Yeah, at highest risk, yes.
At highest risk,
Yes.
right, so they can go down there, which is down by Brothers Table. I forget their exact, is it 100 Willow?
100 Willow.
100 Willow Street, second floor?
Yes.
Second floor. So, yeah, that's really good information to have.
Yeah, I mean, we've really spent a lot of time encouraging the general public
Yep.
to purchase it and have it on hand,
Yeah.
just in case.
Yep.
You never know when you're going to encounter someone
Yep.
on the street. It's very difficult to respond to that kind of situation with a stranger, but it's also really important for people to know that you call 911.
Right.
It's the number one priority is to
Yeah.
getting medical care there as quickly as you possibly
Definitely.
can. Even if you don't have Narcan on you, you know, to put them on their side so that they don't vomit or aspirate if they wake up and call 911.
Yeah.
And you know, try to get help there as quickly as possible. Because with fentanyl, the response time is much shorter because it's so much stronger.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So just in the last few minutes, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the current stuff that you're doing. We're doing, really.
Well, I think that one of the I think that we have been pretty successful at getting a lot of overdose prevention strategies and post-overdose care strategies. And this isn't just us. This has been a collective effort throughout the communities. Institutionalized. So these things are in place and have the ability to be sustained. So we're backtracking a little bit and focusing a bit more on primary prevention. So there are 3 different prevention contracts that the City of Lynn holds.
Right.
One being the overdose prevention, one related to prescription drug misuse, and one being related to general substance use prevention among youth. So what we've done, we've determined is that many heads are better than a couple, and we've really sort of linked up these 3 prevention coalitions or groups to share resources and do a lot more outreach and education in the community. And I think we've been successful at getting invited to a lot more events and have had much more opportunities to reach more people who seem to be a little bit more receptive to hearing this information than they used to be.
Great.
Yeah.
So with our very last minute, one thing that popped out in the data, like one major trend that you saw?
God.
59, 58, no, just kidding. No pressure.
No pressure. Well, I think the Narcan, the increases in Narcan use was significant.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that did jump out at one point, and now it's kind of reversing itself, is that we were seeing that people who were using out in the community were less likely to die from their use than people who used at home.
Right.
Because there was always someone to respond. But because of fentanyl, we're actually seeing, since the response time is decreasing, we're actually seeing the number of people who are dying in the community starting to climb up a little bit more. So it's not the protective factor it once was.
Wow.
So that's something that we need to address.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's great to know for the future.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming on the show with us and
Thanks
chatting
for
with us
having
today. And thank you guys all for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Prevention Works.
And please find us on Facebook at Prevention Works. We're going to start a Facebook Live session with some live question and answers, so hopefully everybody tunes in. And again, thank you so much, Wency Kent, for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.